I'd like to introduce the next speaker, who's our keynote for the AI part of this conference. His name is Professor Allan Dafoe. He's the Senior Research Fellow in the International Politics of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Oxford. He's also Director of the Governance of AI program at the University of Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute, which is a leading site for governance thinking on transformative AI. Through research and policy engagement, the Governance of AI program strives to steer the development of artificial intelligence for the common good. So I would ask you to give him a round of applause as he comes up here and tells us what he thinks.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a lot of ideas in a short amount of time about the potential ideal role of the private sector in AI governance. And we're going to begin at the global level, where we've seen pretty strong rhetoric and I think intentions for global cooperation and developing AI for a global common good. So we see this in the AI for Good events with the UN, AI for Humanity out of France, and AI for the benefit of mankind out of China. And yet this positive intention has a shadow sort of twin intention towards more rivalrous racing for advantage. We see this in China's aspirations to become the world's primary AI innovation center, in US conversations today over export controls to prevent tech diffusion to US potential rivals, and in the broad talk about an AI arms race around the world, and especially in the reaction to Putin's remarks, whoever leads in AI will rule the world. So part of our problem is how are we going to channel these competitive, rivalrous dynamics and incentives that may take us into a sort of where we don't want to go, into a race to the bottom. How can we channel that into more globally beneficial outcomes, into a race to the top? Or more broadly, how can we channel market, social, and political forces to build emerging technology for the common good? Okay, so this is a big problem. I'm going to talk about the role of the private sector in solving this problem. Specifically, I'm talking about it with respect to artificial intelligence, but much of my remarks apply to other similarly potentially transformative technologies. I won't say much about the definition of AI, except to point out that the impact of machine intelligence doesn't just depend on advances in the algorithms, that middle component, but also on advances in sensors and in the extent to which important data in the world is feeding into algorithms, say as we mediate more of our social lives on the internet, and also on the output. As we have more potent actuators, robotics, machine intelligence becomes a more powerful force in the world. So the first thing to say is that the potential upside of AI is tremendous. On the left, in very small font, are application domains that I think could plausibly be transformed for the better by narrow near-term AI. And in fact, it's a fun game to play. Think of an application domain that couldn't be transformed by narrow AI, and I've yet to hear a convincing answer to that. And on the right is a depiction of PwC's estimate of the impact on global economy of AI. And their estimate says in 12 years, AI will contribute $16 trillion to the global economy per year. Now, that's a big number. Clearly, we don't know the answer, but I don't think it's obviously an overestimate. So the upside is substantial. But there are also substantial challenges and risks from AI. I've listed 20 here, categorized according to a certain logic. There's no way I'm going to be able to talk through all of these. Any one of them could consume 2 hours of discussion. Maybe briefly I'll tell you the organizing logic. So on the left we have some issues that we've been talking about at this event. For example, when we deploy algorithms in consequential domains, the values that we have for those domains suddenly bear on the design of the algorithms and how they're used. So issues such as privacy, fairness, auditability, transparency, and so forth. Similarly, as we deploy AI in safety-critical systems, self-driving vehicles, but also the financial market, energy grids, and so forth, we need to worry more about the robustness of our algorithms, their security, interpretability, do we actually know what they're doing, and ultimately, as AI becomes more intelligent and more agential, a term called alignment is something we need to think about. On the right are potential challenges. They're not certain to happen, but they're sufficiently probable that we need to pay attention. The first one we've all at least been exposed to, the idea that there could be substantial labor displacement and an increase in inequality that could undermine the social fabric or the social contract. I think this is a big one. Whether or not it actually happens, I think automation could become the focus for a lot of grievance. But also plausibly it will amplify labor displacement. There's a number of other important issues here, but I'm not going to talk about them. Happy to do so on the panel. Okay, so there's lots of big challenges. Which ones matter the most? So we actually surveyed Americans, and we'll be surveying Europeans and Chinese about various governance challenges. And the first takeaway, and so this presents some results, which will be public in about 2 weeks. The first takeaway is that every governance challenge that we presented to the respondents was regarded as pretty important. So an average of at least 2.45, that's somewhere between somewhat important and very important. So Americans, and I think this holds up for all public bodies, are concerned about the risks and the impacts from AI. And we see this in other questions that we've asked in this survey and in other surveys. Another takeaway is that there is a little differentiation between these different issues. For example, data privacy, cyber attacks, surveillance were regarded as the most impactful, most important, and most likely to impact people around the world. Though there's a lot of nuance in these responses. A second set of results I want to share is trust in actors to develop AI in the public interest. So here we asked, again, Americans, which sort of entities or to what extent they trust these entities to build AI and manage AI in the public interest. And there's some interesting takeaways. To a first order, Americans largely don't trust most of these actors. So the average was about 1.3 out of a scale of 0 to 3. So that's not much confidence to a little bit of confidence. The entities they trusted the most are the US military and university researchers. And then similarly, we see substantial trust for different scientific bodies and the private sector. So you see Google, Microsoft, Amazon, tech companies doing pretty well. They don't trust the US federal government or US state governments. And there's a few outliers within the tech companies, namely Facebook is the lowest in trust here. And I'm showing these results both because they're interesting, there's a lot to glean from them, but because I think they illustrate one of the most salient governance challenges that we're going to face, which is the potential loss of trust and sort of the breakdown in the fabric of trust between different stakeholders, public, government, private sector. And if that happens, we could see public reactions that lead to ineffective regulation, for example, which would lose all those benefits I mentioned, as well as probably lead to a regulatory climate that's not well suited to addressing the risks that I showed. And I think this issue is pressing. I don't think we have necessarily 5 years to solve this problem. It could be a matter of months or 1 or 2 years required to maintain sufficient social cohesion and trust. Okay, so those are some of the challenges. How will governance go? Well, as the title says, governance of AI will not be easy for a number of reasons. One way of illustrating the difficulty here is that you can think of AI as a general purpose technology, similar to the combustion engine. So the combustion engine had profound impacts in society, in the economy, in military, that would be hard to foresee. Right? There's a lot of uncertainty about the impact of this technology. 2, the harms and the benefits are diffuse. They harm people sometimes generations later across the world who were not party to the initial decision to invent it or deploy it in a certain way. There's a number of other properties of AI and some kinds of general purpose technologies that make it especially difficult to govern. So it's fast moving, often scientific developments are irreversible, so like nuclear weapons, once they're built, it's hard to uninvent them. And so if there are dangerous techniques, it's prudent for us to anticipate them in advance and try to build the institutions to manage them before they're out sort of in the world having impacts. AI is dual use and likely to be broadly available. Understanding AI requires substantial technical competence. And then lastly, there are strong competitive incentives between firms and also between countries to develop AI for advantage, for profit, for power, and that sometimes comes into conflict with other values. And on the right-hand side, I have a list of what we can think of as object-level examples where we might want to govern in certain ways. And we could go through each of these as a case study of how difficult it is today to come to a productive governance solution. Okay, So now I'm going to offer the beginnings of a conversation of a solution. On the left are various titles for this because we don't yet know what to call it. So we can think of it as sort of articulating a notion of AI social responsibility. We can think of it as trying to channel the AI race into a race to the top. In some ways, what I'm about to describe is implicit in all of us when we're thinking about how we cooperate, how we develop norms, better norms for a community. And so this is just that made explicit. So it's a cooperation cookbook, or it's public goods 101 for emerging technology. Okay, what is it? There's two stages. The first stage involves us accepting and elevating and expecting higher levels of responsibility by AI actors. So in short, we get the AI actors around a table and we sort of reach common knowledge. We all nod and say, yes, we accept that some of us have substantial responsibility for AI. And we can put a little bit more precision on this. I think we can agree, or I think we should agree, that actors who most benefit from AI or who are most influential in developing AI have the most responsibility for AI. So if we agree to that, then step one is we nod our heads and say, yes, that is the case, and the actors who hold those responsibility accept that responsibility. Step two, then, is that society has to make a commitment to supporting those actors who uphold the responsibility. So we need to find resources, whether it's governmental funding, consumer sentiment, ethical AI talent that chooses where to work, or other sources, even other private sector collaborations, that commits to working with and supporting those AI actors who most uphold their responsibility. Okay, then the next four steps in stage two involves clarifying exactly what does it mean to be responsible, right? So the first step was pretty vague. We just have to elevate this expectation of responsibility. Stage two is where we really become concrete. So step one of that is to define responsibility. I think AI actors, part of their responsibility is themselves trying to define what it means for them to be responsible, because they're in a good position to understand what an actor like themselves ought to be doing for various values. Step two is those actors demonstrate to the world that they are in fact living up to at least their own definition of responsibility, if not other definitions. Step three is we deliberate. We, being a bit vague here, that can be the private sector, it can be NGOs, it can be the public, it can be technical experts, governments. We argue with each other about what notion of responsibility makes the most sense for different kinds of actors in different application areas. And I note this needs to be both inclusive and patient. It's going to be difficult. And then step four is that we really try to assess the extent to which any given actor is upholding and living up to their responsibility. And then we reward those who are doing a good job of it. And this last part is really important because we want to make this whole thing incentive compatible, right? We want actors, firms, scientific labs who are being more responsible than others to be rewarded for it and to flourish because of it. So to give some examples of efforts by private sector and other actors to define responsibility, depicted here. Now these are mostly abstract principles or very aspirational principles. They don't yet have enough meat to really know how to implement them. There are other attempts to give much more refined articulations of what it means to be responsible, say in developing algorithms and deploying algorithms in government, or from Microsoft recently in the use of facial recognition. So I think both of these are commendable because they're really trying to say, here's what it means to be ethical, responsible in the use of AI in these domains. These will not be the last words, but this is part of this attempt, this sort of circular, this iterative process where we try to define responsibility, we then deliberate about it and hopefully improve our understanding of what it means, what it should mean to be responsible. And then finally, we want to go even beyond that and assess the extent to which actors are being responsible. And for this, I want to offer this sort of micro case study of DeepMind Health, which I think does a really exemplary job of this. So DeepMind Health invited this independent review panel. So these are independent experts who are going to come together, be supported by DeepMind funding, given access to DeepMind Health's operations and details about how they're working. But they then had a license to judge DeepMind Health on the extent to which they are sort of behaving in a responsible, ethical way. And this led to two annual reports. And in the second one, DeepMind Health articulated 12 principles for DeepMind Health to follow, which DeepMind Health then agreed those were reasonable principles to be judged upon. And these 12 principles are pretty substantial. They're not something that's easy to satisfy. They have a substantial bite. And then this independent review panel was going to hold DeepMind Health accountable to whether they were living up to these principles and what they could do to improve how they're addressing those principles. So I think this is really exemplary. This is something that a lot of private sector actors could do, right? All you have to do is be open enough to invite external experts to publicly engage your work and evaluate your work. I can imagine it's scary to do that, but if we succeed at getting this cycle going where society supports those who are being most pro-social, most responsible, then actors should be rewarded for doing this. There's of course a coda to this story, which is that DeepMind Health has recently been merged with Google Health. Now it's unclear exactly what that means for a number of their principles and how DeepMind Health would operate, but it does show that private sector is facing this tension between can you commit to various sorts of ethical principles, or to what extent do you need to enter an organizational framework that's more focused on potentially a bottom line or profit. So I think there's a real opportunity here for us to elevate norms about cooperation, for us to clarify them, and again, for us to reward those actors who are doing the best job, and implicitly also sanction those who are not living up to their responsibility. So if you want to be part of this conversation with us, we'd love to hear from you. We're at Oxford, and thank you for your time.